Welcome back to MythVision Podcast. I'm your host, Derek Lambert. Recently on Joe Rogan's podcast, there was a discussion/debate, the tension was in the air, between our guest today, Dr. Flint Dibble, and Graham Hancock. Welcome to MythVision, Flint.
Hi, it's great to be here, Derek. Thanks.
Do you mind if I call you Flint or Dr. Dibble, or what's the best?
Flint's fine. It's all good.
For those who aren't acquainted with you or haven't seen the debate, can you tell us a little bit about your expertise, who you are, and what you were doing on Joe Rogan's podcast?
That's a long story. That's like my life story. So I'm an archaeologist, and I mostly work in the ancient Greek world, though I've also worked in Neanderthal caves, Egyptian tombs, a wide variety of places throughout the Mediterranean world. And so my expertise is environmental archaeology, and I have a YouTube, and I'm on X/Twitter, and I oftentimes try to share archaeology with the public. It's something I'm passionate about. And at the same time, a lot of the public always comes and asks questions about things like Graham Hancock's ideas. And so in a sense, when his Netflix show came out, I wrote a viral Twitter thread and things escalated. And it ended up being that I ended up on Joe Rogan to talk with Graham about his ideas and to try to represent an archaeological sort of point of view about those kind of ideas that he has about a lost Ice Age civilization. And so, yeah.
Thank you for joining us and explaining that for those who may not know. It might pique your curiosity to go watch the debate yourself. It was like 4 hours long. It was worth it, in my opinion. This was the first time, I think, publicly someone representing mainstream academia in respect to archaeology combated Graham head on.
Well, that's actually something that, look, when I was on there, I didn't want to address every minor point, but he actually was completely wrong. He said this was the first time. That's not true. He's had 3 showdowns with Zahi Hawass. One of the famous ones is when Zahi Hawass storms off at the start of one. However, he also had earlier ones in the 1990s with Zahi Hawass, one on a cruise ship off the coast of Alaska, which was broadcast on the radio. And so he doesn't like to bring these up. He also was invited, I think, to Penn State to have a conversation with the late professor, I think it was Garrett Fagan or Brian Fagan. And when he was billed as a pseudoscientist, he refused to go. And so he has had other sort of circumstances like this. I don't know why he tries to cover them up. They're from about 20 years ago or so, 25 years ago. Yeah.
I have to introduce this in a way that people can empathize with what's going on. Joe Rogan, I have this kind of tug of war inside when I listen to him, especially during this debate. I'm like, good job, Joe. Oh, what, Joe? Come on, Joe. And it's this weird thing that makes me internally struggle because little fun fact about me is I was a diehard Randall Carlson and Graham Hancock fan 4 to 7 years ago when I started this channel. And in fact, one of the things that inspired me to even start this channel was alternative hypotheses, alternative rabbit holes, and things like that. And MythVision started off as kind of a fringe scholar, like, let me find these fringe theories, fringe hypotheses to explain origins of Christianity. The Roman emperors created it, and it's all a conspiracy. And I did all of these things. And I started to mature throughout the years as I learned more about what actual academia said. Now, you could see me with people from Cambridge, Princeton, Yale, Harvard, all over the world, kind of bringing the cutting edge. Yeah, exactly. And so I want to start by saying I understand why their ideas are appealing and attractive. And one analogy I'll give, and then love to have your comments here on what is the psychology behind why so many people are mesmerized by these things, the aliens and stuff. And I was at a restaurant working as a construction worker, as a supervisor at this company, and my wife was eating with me, and I said, honey, because she's not familiar with history that well. And I said, you ever heard of a place called Atlantis? And she's like, no. And I'm like, it was this massive civilization. They had rules and very, very noble nation that tried to take care of itself and help others. And I started to describe Atlantis in moral senses and how they were everyday people, mom, pops, sisters, brothers, families, and all this. But something went wrong. and a deluge, a flood took place that completely wiped them out. Notice how you don't even know about that. Well, imagine hypothetically in 30, 40,000 years from now, we have another restart because of a worldwide catastrophe. And someone goes, have you ever heard the story of America? And she goes, whoa. And I said, now imagine we've been completely forgotten. All we have are these faces on this rock mountain of these people who supposedly ruled this place we call America. And I started to paint it in almost like a fictional way. It was so appealing that me and her were kind of like, even I'm telling the story.
It's seductive. You know, I think you've convinced me.
Right? So there's something about that in our minds. We like stories. So then the question is the story of Atlantis, is there any historical basis? Is it true? What are your thoughts as an expert in the ancient Greek world?
Yeah, it is decidedly not true. It's actually really clear when you start looking at all the evidence that we have for things like mythology and for the context where it's written down, Plato itself. You know, you look at the way Plato introduces the story, and it's introduced as a conversation that takes place the day after the Republic, where Socrates and colleagues, in a sense, come up with this ideal city-state. They devise the constitution and how the morals for the city. And so the next day, what they want to do is they want to see this ideal city and discuss how it will perform in a war. And it sort of becomes like from Sim City, building the city, to a game of Civilization. They want to see what will happen with their ideal city-state when it has an opponent. And so what they do is they say, let's create this thought experiment. Let's make the ideal city-state Athens, and let's come up with Atlantis as the opponent. And so that's the entire setting for the conversation where Plato comes up and tells the story of Atlantis through the words of Critias, who was one of the tyrants of Athens after the Spartans defeated Athens in the Peloponnesian War. And so, you know, the whole setup makes it really clear that it's just a philosophical thought experiment. And so, you know, you can kind of even ground truth it. So you can fact check it if you want. You know, people like to see what you can see in real space, if you see what I mean. And so what everybody ignores is, so people looking for Atlantis, they go to the descriptions of Atlantis in the Timaeus and the Critias, the two dialogues. And they sort of have, like, you know, circular islands and this kind of stuff, the descriptions of the temples and whatever, right? And they try to find it on the planet somewhere, you know, some circular monument or island or something. And so what they forget to do is we could fact check the description of Athens, because half of this actually describes Athens, you know, the early Athens that's supposed to fight Atlantis. And guess what? We know the archaeology of Athens, and we can see, and we know the geology of Athens. And for example, in this Critias describes the Acropolis and another bedrock outcrop, Lycabettos, is connected. And we know that just geologically could not be true. And so in that sense, we can fact check that. If we can't trust the details about Athens itself, Plato's from Athens, he taught in Athens, he died in Athens, right? If we can't trust the details about Athens, how can we trust any of these details about Atlantis, if you see what I mean? And so the third thing, which people don't seem to, I guess, realize, is we also have a whole lot of evidence for the way that oral myth and stories and legends in the Greek world are kind of transmitted, right? And so we have this sort of evidence that we can fact check against archaeology again. So, for example, in the Iliad, you know, the Trojan War cycle, we have these descriptions of sort of shields and spears and helmets. And we can compare that to our own archaeology and art history of shields and spears and helmets and swords at the times when this oral poetry was happening, right? And so we can actually find these correlates directly in the Iliad and the Odyssey, and we can actually find them from different periods in Greek prehistory. So sometimes the poet is describing a Bronze Age style spear. Sometimes the poet is describing an Iron Age style spear. And so it's this kind of mishmash of Bronze Age and Iron Age culture, because it's oral poetry that's passed on over hundreds and hundreds of years. And so we can fact check that and see that, and it lines up just perfectly. We can see the artistic representations of these oral legends. In fact, we have art of scenes or examples of myths that we don't even have text for. right? So we have like, Achilles and Ajax dicing right by the sea outside of Troy, this sort of snapshot of some legend that's lost of this kind of game they were playing. We even know that Achilles is winning because every single time he's thrown showing the dice, he has the higher roll because they speak on the vase. It's oftentimes carved out the words, he has a 3 and Ajax has a 2. And so, we have this rich artistic record, but nothing for Atlantis. It's just literally nothing. It's just a philosophical allegory.
So there's so much you said here that's amazing. I just discovered that on a vase, there is an image of a giant sea serpent spewing up Jason, the Argonaut, with Athena, but we don't have any written myth about it anymore. We lost it. And so I actually am looking for antecedents to the Jonah myth in the Bible, and this is one of this image comes to mind on top of Heracles with Heracles and Perseus and these various myths of these sea beasts that they're fighting. And I'm like, seems to be some possible correlation between Jonah and what we're finding in the Greek myths over here, but we've lost it, like you said. The other thing is people looking for Atlantis are over here in like Florida Keys and stuff. I mean, like, is there any reason to go that far anyway?
No, definitely not. I mean, the way Plato describes it, it's like another city-state is how it's described, like another Greek-style city-state. In fact, in many ways, what people think is actually, it's the roles are switched. Athens, the way that Athens is described, it seems to be like a political allegory for the Spartans, right? Because they have this very communal lifestyle where they're living on the Acropolis in these barracks. And, it's exactly how the Spartans live. And so on the other hand, Atlantis seems to be the lavish, over extravagant as an allegory for either. Sometimes some people argue it's for the Persians. Other people argue it's for the Athenians themselves as a warning. But it's just kind of silly. Like you say, coming over to America and things like that, this idea that like there were any survivors, for example, of the flood that destroyed Atlantis, right? The book ends. It actually is cut off. It's not finished. We don't know if Plato ever finished it or if we just have that much preserved. It's not clear. But the book ends with the destruction of Atlantis. There are no survivors. And so, this idea of survivors teaching a lost, hunter-gatherers, the secrets of advanced technology, that's a complete modern invention. And do you know where it comes from? It comes from a book of fiction written by Francis Bacon in the early 17th century called The New Atlantis. And what's really interesting is that book also was never finished, which is kind of weird. Wow. But that book of fiction set up this idea of sort of Atlantis having survivors that had lost in advanced technology. And then slowly from the 17th all the way down to the 19th century, it was converted into this myth of some sort of lost Ice Age civilization with advanced tech that like somehow has evidence, though it doesn't have any evidence that everybody's familiar with through Graham Hancock and others. Yeah.
This is an amazing observation. So it's safe to say, without necessarily direct influence, it could be independent due to the fact that the snowball effect of this continuing in the imagination of people who are trying to come up with explanations. Maybe they're scientific and they're trying to like hypothesize on what they think, but most of this sounds a little bit more fictive in the imagination. Like I showed earlier, explaining that, honey, you ever heard of the story of America? And there's a sense in which we all kind of like a myth. We like, Marvel and Capcom and the video, like these serious, interesting fictional worlds that we enter, Lord of the Rings, the list goes on and on.
And you know what's interesting? You can even see this with J.R.R. Tolkien. So, right, J.R.R. Tolkien is a scholar who studies myth. But what's interesting is when he adapts the Atlantis story and creates Numenor, he doesn't adapt Plato's Atlantis. He adapts this 19th century Ignatius Donnelly's version where Numenor is destroyed in a flood, but the survivors make it to the mainland and set up Gondor and Arnor and teach the other men this kind of technology of this high civilization of Numenor. And so he's even adapting that kind of more entertaining story, if you see what I mean, to his fiction. And knowingly so, because he was surely familiar. He read ancient Greek. He was a scholar of myth and ancient Greek and Latin at Oxford. And so, so he knew what he was doing. And it's kind of interesting because he mentions in his letters that he has these dreams of a flood. And that's what causes him to write Numenor and into that and everything. Yeah.
Wow. I'll say one of the big controversial moments on the Joe Rogan podcast that you had with Graham was these accusations. It quickly became this, oh, Flint, you're doing this what they would call woke kind of stuff, trying to, you know, discredit Graham with saying what he's saying is racist. And then the other side, which would be your side, I'd like to give a voice to today, and that is, I personally know as a content creator, as a YouTuber, when I'm engaging with other ideas that I'm finding a pseudo or alternative or whatever, there always ends up this crowd of anti-Semites or you know, like there are racist people literally that are not ashamed to be that way publicly, who are using the work of certain individuals. And they practically have a safe haven in these people without those people themselves condemning those outright, very outspoken saying, no, 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 no. And even if you're borrowing from ideas from people who had these racist or ugly ideas in the past, you know, letting yourself know, like, this guy was off on this, I think he's right on this, but this guy is just horrible in this area, or whatever it is. You were trying to express that Graham is holding the ideas that people are recognizing these sources, that there are a lot of racist tendencies in these sources. And can you explain what those are and what you're trying to get across before Joe and him ganged up on you and pretty much just want to pin you down?
I mean, and this all goes back again to the history of these ideas, right? And so this idea, I mentioned sort of Francis Bacon, around the same time he's writing the New Atlantis, the Spanish Crown is using Greek stories, both Atlantis and the myth of the Hesperides, as a reason for the Spanish Crown to have a claim on the indigenous territories in the Americas. And so, there's this entire wrap up from colonialism period, 16th century up through the 19th century. You could see, for example, the Trail of Tears with Andrew Jackson. He specifically cites this idea that there's an earlier civilization that was responsible for the Native American mounds as a reason to kick them off their land and to march them west. And so, this kind of fake history of this kind of Atlantis advanced civilization that existed earlier has been used time and time again in the past to displace indigenous peoples in the Americas. And so there's this history there that's very much wrapped up in these kind of ideas.
Reminds me of Mormonism too, by the way.
Yes, you can definitely see that in several of the myths of Mormonism. And, you can see this of finds, for example, of people planting in the 19th century, sort of 19th century forgeries of Judeo-Christian Near Eastern texts to try to make it look like the lost tribes of Israel were there or something like that in the Americas, and to sort of strip credit away from indigenous people for their heritage and their rights to the land as well. You have to realize this is all wrapped up in taking land. And so, this is straight up colonization is what's going on. And so there's this dark history to it. And I mean, this carries forward. You can see this carry forward even into sort of the Aryan supremacy myths of the Nazis, right? So Himmler, he sets up the Aachen-Nerbe Institute, which actually goes out and does archaeological excavations around the world, trying to demonstrate that the Aryans are the descendants of the Atlanteans, and therefore are a more advanced race. And so there's this whole subcurrent to this kind of idea. It doesn't mean that everybody that believes in a lost civilization is some sort of overt racist who mistreats people of color. I'm not trying to argue that in the least, but there is this undercurrent. And as you said, you can see it among some people more loud and overt online, people that say this is very clearly a white civilization, that say the ancestors of indigenous peoples were squatting in the ruins of some advanced civilization. I've seen that put that way. And so it's just like there are these much more harmful actors, in people today that are really overtly twisting these kind of words. And so I think I even said at some point, Graham, do you want to denounce this kind of people? And so it's just like, if you, I'm not trying to accuse it of you, but you should distance yourself from this kind of stuff. I mean, we have to deal with this in archaeology all the time. Look, earlier archaeologists, real archaeology also was part and parcel of colonialism. This is certainly, archaeologists in the 19th century, they looted and stole from conquered people, and so we are trying to deal with the ramifications of that today. And so I'm very strongly for repatriation and giving ownership of material culture to, you know, the original countries where they're from. And I think that we should be working with people. I mean, I do this all the time. When I go to Greece, I follow the Greek law that the Ministry of Culture sets up. I've had to go to Greece to collect material in March, and it turns out something was signed wrong on one of my forms, so I couldn't go. And so I need to go back again. Sorry, I couldn't bring the material back with me to Cardiff to sample it for isotope analysis. And so, you know, I have to go back again. You know, this kind of bureaucratic red tape is part and parcel, but the Greeks should control their heritage, just like people in more impoverished areas should control their own heritage as well. And so, you know, archaeology, I'm not trying to excuse my past colleagues and any current colleagues that act dismissively towards, you know, indigenous people or stakeholders. I think we need to be working with them.
What is your walk away based on that experience with Graham on this issue of distancing himself from those online? It felt to me, and then I'd like to get your thoughts, is that Joe and him were trying to really nail you for this, as if you were wrong in making accusations. And in no way in that process, all he said was, well, once you label someone that, you've ruined their reputation and you don't even have to defeat their arguments, which, by the way, what arguments, what evidence, right? That was clearly brought up.
And I clearly defeated those. Yeah,
clearly. But like, you know, while he said this bad thing, you call me racist, you call me this and that, like he made it seem like that's what you called him. And you were trying to say, I'm not calling you that. I'm saying you're creating an environment or like opening this environment where all these people who are using your work, who are in the same avenue as you, and you look like the rest of the ducks that are lined up. You're not this different thing, even if you yourself aren't. What is your takeaway on that? You've never heard Graham ever make the statement like outright that it sounds racist. I don't know. What are your thoughts? Have you?
He's made some statements in the 90s that sound kind of racist. I think some of that is older use of language, like you know, the language that today we wouldn't use. He's fairly careful. I mean, as people point out, he's married to a person of color. And so, you know, I think he does try to be careful not to be overtly offensive. I think, and so on that, I commend him, but I wish he would, you know, denounce this kind of misuse of his material. And I that worries me that he's not willing to go do that, because he really should. That's just kind of disgusting not to denounce this kind of people that call it a white civilization and say these nasty things about indigenous people that are not capable of their own heritage. And so, you know, my takeaway on canceling is just ludicrous. I'm not trying to cancel Graham. He's uncancelable. He's too much of a celebrity. He has, you know, a major TV show. He's a bestseller on Amazon, and Amazon's the one that lumps his book in the subcategory of archaeology, you know, and it's frequently rated in the top few books there. And, you know, Netflix rates it as a docuseries. It's saying I'm trying to cancel him. I'm like a fucking nobody. I don't know how else to put that. Like, I'm a scholar. What? I now have 35,000 Twitter followers, and like now I jumped from 4,000 YouTube subscribers to 12,000. Come subscribe to me.
Right.
I'm gonna do some more material on this. But you know, I want to do a series on Atlantis. Is one that I've been working on, a scripted series that has some animation and really explains why we should not be believing in these philosophical allegories as true, and delves into that in depth. But you know, but what I am is I'm a scholar, and what we study is the history of these ideas and how they're deployed in today's world. That's what we do. You know, I study this kind of thing. And so for me not to bring that up is kind of silly. You bring up the history of ideas. When people talk about communism, they bring up Karl Marx. You know, this is just how things go. When you talk about stuff, you talk about the history of it. That's how scholarship works. So, you know, it's not trying to tar him as a racist. I give him every opportunity to distance himself from racism, and I hope he does more strongly. Another thing, you mentioned Joe Rogan. Is one of the things that surprised me was about near the end of that part of the conversation, where I brought up the image of Quetzalcoatl from pre-contact having darker skin, not white skin as described in these kind of post-colonial sources. And, you know, even Joe then realized what the point I was trying to make. He started telling Graham, he said, you know, of course, colonialism and subjugation is going to have an impact on these people in the story they tell. And, you know, and Graham's like, well, I'm just interested in these sort of points. And Joe's like, of course this is going to have an impact. And Graham just couldn't see that. I don't understand how he couldn't see that, because, legends and stories change over time. What's going on has an impact. If you go watch 300, the movie from the 1960s, it's totally, you can see how it's an allegory for the Cold War, with one side being the West and the other side being the East, the communist East. And then you look at 300 in the 2000s, and it's very much an allegory for, what's going on at that time, the Iraq War. And so you can see this very, very clearly in the choices, the directors and casting decisions that they made for those two versions of that same story, if you see what I mean.
Right.
And so it's just that this is just how stories go. They're told in a contemporary environment.
Myth making. Yeah. Myth making is always trying to anchor itself into a subtle contemporary historical situation often. And usually scholars can see between the lines, that kind of thing. An interesting point that you brought up about Joe was, at first I was a little bit like annoyed. That was the tug of war that I have, because I'm like, man, we need more really good academics bringing the fire, bringing the real good arguments. And seeing Joe throughout that start to go to your side, to be honest with you, I think light bulbs started going off for him as you were making your point. And the big killer was, what evidence do we have? And based on what we have already discovered, because he's acting like we haven't turned over every single pebble on planet Earth to find the secret, massive, advanced technology. I'm just kidding, because I don't want to straw man him, but he changed his view, it seems, during this episode to making them shamanic. What's that mean? A bunch of mushroom eating,
I mean, I think he argues that at times. I really tried to. I tried to go into this and do what's called steel manning him, in a sense, take the best version of his idea and show what the evidence actually is. And so, and I didn't even want to bring up race to begin with, because I realized for the context, that's not the right venue to do that. And so, that's not, people don't, in that context, did not want to hear the history of the ideas. They wanted to hear what the actual archaeological evidence was. And so, that was what I went there with. And I was kind of surprised to hear him say there was nothing after how many books and, TV shows and stuff like that, to say, oh, there's nothing. Everywhere I've brought you actually is not evidence for my civilization. And it's like, whoa, one of the things I realized a week later, sort of thinking back on the conversation, is he specifically avoided talking about any actual archaeological sites. He either wanted to do the victimization, I'm calling him names or something like that, or he wanted to go to these kind of geological natural features that look sort of human-made, but don't really look that human-made if you're an archaeologist and know what architecture actually looks like, And so it's just sort of, he wanted to avoid going to any archaeological sites, and that kind of made me feel good. It was like, all right, he realized that came with evidence, and he realized he didn't have the evidence to even argue those points.
And even when you guys did try to get him to talk about the one site,
Gunung Padang,
down. There's supposedly ground radar, and Joe had some really good points. Joe was like, well, so this is less evidence than this road that you can at least see that you're claiming is underwater over here, like below Florida. I don't know the exact location. That's why I'm just saying. I know it's somewhere in the region off the coast there. In the Atlantic. And I'm looking at it going, dang, this is a good point, because all you have is like bounce off radars. There's not really any, like, we're not looking at it and actually observing what is there. It's all based on bouncing off these, the technology that's looking through the ground to try and discover what's down there. And when y'all pinned him there to try and no, we need to deal with this for a moment. He's like, it's in the paper. He couldn't find it in the paper. He's like, you just got to go read the paper by this guy over here who
that's on my website.
Yeah. And you kept bringing evidence, which leads me to my question. Was there any evidence you mowed this over for a year? I imagine you had sleepless nights thinking about what's coming. Was there any,
not many, but yeah.
You know what I mean, though? Like, you really thought about this.
I had a lot of shower conversations. Where I was like, all right, this conversation's going to happen. Let's game plan it. Yeah.
Was there any argument in your mind that you were like, I'm coming, I need to really nail this one, and you never got to mention it? Was there any arguments that you thought about that you brought in your computer and said, this needs to be shown to Joe. This needs to be explained. And
yeah, there
he
was
never got to it.
one. So I just put out a video last week about kind of my reaction to the event, and in there I had the one. So I sort of only came in with two sort of, let's say, gotcha points.
Right.
One of them was his numerology stuff, the sacred numbers that he uses with the procession, and I got to get that in there. Where what he does is he talks about, and sorry, let me backtrack a little to set this up. So we moved to Egypt, and because Joe wants to talk about Egypt, and so
Right.
Graham thinks he wants to go to Edfu, and that's the one I didn't get to bring up. And so I say, because he claims that he has these hieroglyphic texts from Edfu, they're called the Edfu texts, that tell the story of Atlantis in Egypt. It's an Egyptian story, which is what's told in Plato's, Critias, that Solon got it from Egypt. And so he makes this big claim in Magicians of the Gods about this. And so he starts bringing this up. He says, let's go to Edfu. And my best gotcha was these Edfu texts. I'll tell you what it is in a second, or if you want to see it written out, it's on my latest YouTube video. But so I say, yes, let's go to Edfu. And he must have recognized how confident I was, because he backed off and never went to Edfu. They actually even cut me out saying, yeah, let's talk about that in the final release, which they did very minimal editing. I think it was probably because we were talking over each other. They didn't do any editing that I saw to try to make me look bad or anything like that. It was professionally edited. I just think we were talking at the same time, but in that talking at the same time, I said, yes, let's go to Edfu. And he gave me this little look, and then he didn't go to Edfu at all. Instead, what he did is he went to his numerology spiel, where he talks, which was my second gotcha, so it worked out well for me, and where he talks about the height of the Great Pyramid, and you multiply it by, I forget what it is, 58,000 or something like that, which why? Because that's 72 times 14,000 or some crap like that, and that equals the polar radius of the Earth. And so when I was sort of preparing for this, I was recovering from surgery, and I was sitting there kind of like zonked out on painkillers, and I saw him use this math on a podcast. And I was like, oh, he likes to talk about this. Let's figure out a response. And so, I came up with the response I used, where I showed how you could do this with pretty much any number. And so I showed how to do it with the number of columns in the Parthenon. There's 69 columns, magic number, boom, you do the right multiplication, you get the, equatorial circumference of the Earth. Or you could do it in reverse. You do 420, so that every time you're smoking a joint, you're connecting mathematically with the Earth, And so I got that one in there, and I was like, this is just what math is. You can figure out how numbers relate if you do it backwards. And Joe's like, oh yeah, that makes sense, And it's like, no, Graham, this is not an argument, if you see what I mean. So sorry, long story to get to what I left out. The Edfu text, in his book, The Magicians of the Gods, he has these long quotes of these Edfu texts, and they're so terribly researched. It's ridiculous. He's not quoting the actual Edfu text. He's quoting some book on Egyptian religion that's discussing the Edfu text. B, the Edfu texts date to after Plato, so after Atlantis story. C, the quotes he grabs are from hundreds of pages away. He grabs one sentence from page 253, then puts it next to a sentence from page 100, then next to a sentence from page 50, and says this is the coherent story of Atlantis being destroyed. And it's like, what are you fucking talking about, man?
Wow.
You can't do that. It's like taking a sentence, I don't know, from the book of Job, and then another sentence from the book of Genesis, and making a new biblical story out of it. And so it's just like, man, it's a real gotcha. I actually did it to his books, where I found different sentences on different pages, and I told the story that I wanted to tell of Flint being an archaeologist that excavated some site and proved there was no Ice Age civilization, because you can do that using his words. Using his words, you can say whatever you want. Just put some ellipses in there and some footnotes, and you can say whatever you want.
That, just one comment about the mathematics stuff, that appeased or appealed to me when I was first listening to Randall Carlson. He gets into geometric shapes and the precession of the equinoxes. For those who don't know, the Earth is on a tilt, and so it goes through these almost zodiac type ages, right? Which are like 2,240 years, something like that. For 24,000 year full rotation, 24 to 26,000 year full rotation of the Earth on its axis, and it goes through these ages. And I thought I was decoding esoterically the Bible at this time in my life, going, oh my gosh. So you had the golden calf, which, by the way, at that time, I didn't know to think of bulls as ancient Near Eastern, like animals symboling sex and fertility and the god. I'm thinking bull as in Taurus, the zodiac sign, and I'm thinking completely esoteric and anachronistic, and thinking that's the sign of Taurus, and they're moving into the sign of Aries, which is why you end up having the lamb who was slain from the foundation of the world, the lamb. Then we're moving into the fish, which Jesus represents the fish, going into Pisces and eventually getting into Aquarius. Like, I was thinking like that when I was listening to these guys. And then I'm listening to him go into the calculations and the perfect. Even Joe seems sold on this idea that, like, I've studied the pyramids thoroughly and I've listened to the different hypotheses on how they built it. By the way, we aren't sure exactly how the Great Pyramids of Giza were, built exactly, but we know they were built. The inscriptions talk about this. We have enough evidence. I just interviewed Kara Cooney, who's an Egyptologist.
Nice.
She went over this. She loves you, by the way, and she wanted me to give you a shout out on this episode.
Great.
But
hi, Kara.
Right? But the idea that it's just so almost impossible and we couldn't replicate them today. Well, I said to my brother-in-law, I don't think we would want to put that much money into stacking stones today, because we don't.
Of course, we could do it if we tried to. It's the effort of tens of thousands of people to do that. That's what it takes. And are we going to employ tens of thousands of people to build a pyramid? I don't think so. We're going to do it a more affordable way in our world. I mean, this idea that we need to do the same thing to prove it is ridiculous. We know that people can move large stones. We've demonstrated how to cut and move large stones using the kind of technology that existed in the Bronze Age. It's really not rocket scientists. It's moving large stones, and people are pretty capable of doing that. I mean, I've had to see people do that on archaeological sites. We excavate out a several ton in marble inscription, and we got to get it out of the trench. And, the local work men and women that do this on a regular basis, they know how to do this. It's just ropes and muscle power. And, they're moving a multi-ton inscription. I couldn't freaking do it. I wouldn't even know the first bet, but they know how to lever it, and they know how to, get it to shift off its axis, to get it, start walking it out of a trench, and then to pull it up with a series of ropes, some people pushing, some people pulling. You get enough muscle power, you can move several ton stones. I've seen people do this. I always find this funny when people are like, archaeologists don't know this stuff. They're not like stonemasons or something like that. They've never seen how to move large stones. And it's like, how do you think all those large stones you see lying around an archaeological site when you go visit the Giza or the Acropolis in Athens or wherever, you see many ton stones sitting around, usually in stone piles. Those were probably moved in the 19th century, most of them by hand, by people, by a crew of workers using nothing more than muscle power. And I've seen it with my own eyes, people moving several ton large stones. I've even helped out on a rope. I've never been in charge of moving one, but I've helped out on a rope. And so it's just like, this idea that it's something so impossible, just it makes no sense. So we have to move these stones all the time when we encounter one in an archaeological site, and we need to get it out of the way. I don't know how else to put it. That's what we have to do. And so, yeah.
Thank you for that. As far as Graham Hancock's position goes, he kind of admitted we don't have any evidence of that advanced civilization now on this episode, though. He goes through an entire Netflix series and written many books making the statement that we have this evidence. I know that because I've seen people who've quoted his book on Twitter. They're showing the references and stuff where he made bold claims. Seems like he's backpedaling. But my question is, what evidence do we have, again, for civilizations around the time they're claiming an advanced one exists? It's just hunter-gatherers?
Yeah, at that time, so they're claiming in the Ice Age, all we have is hunter-gatherers. All around the world, we have thousands and thousands of sites. I think I showed the Paleolithic radiocarbon database of Europe, which stretches all the way to Siberia, has something like 13,000 sites in it. And so from the Ice Age, and they're all hunter-gatherer locales. And so it's just, it's we have so much evidence for hunter-gatherers. We have it in the places that he says we're not looking. We have, hunter-gatherer sites in the Amazon from that period. We have hunter-gatherer sites in the Sahara from that period. We have hunter-gatherer sites from the coastlines of that period. And we have hunter-gatherer sites that we found underwater from that period. Time and time again, we have these sites. And so that's what we have. I mean, I tend to think that civilization is a misnomer. We don't really use that term very frequently in archaeology anymore.
Mhm.
It's just something that too many people have defined in too many ways, so it's become kind of meaningless. And so we've kind of learned that things like agriculture, sedentism, urbanism, working with larger architecture, all these things advance and change, I should say. Advance is even a misnomer, separately in different regions at different times, if you see what I mean. So it's not like there's some sort of complete package. Once they sort of all occur together in the Middle East, in the Southwest Asia, then they move with people as a package that we call the Neolithic package. But, you know, the development of each of those different technologies and phenomena in Southwest Asia sort of happens independently. Same thing in Mesoamerica, South America, East Asia, etc. And so, you know, in different areas of domestication and sedentism and urbanism and, you know, different ways of working in stone. And so, you know, this idea of civilization, that's why we see it as a misnomer. Too often what we do is what people in the past did, archaeologists and scholars, is they drew this line between civilization and primitive savages. And, you know, that idea, it's not how we think of hunter-gatherers either. What we've learned is that hunter-gatherers are actually fairly complex. You know, they're doing some quite amazing things to survive and thrive in tough landscapes and sometimes not in tough landscapes. And when they are surviving and thriving, at times they're building fantastic large monuments like at Göbekli Tepe. And so, you know, we see hunter-gatherers have this kind of know-how. And so there's no reason to assume that, you know, they're not civilized, if you see what I mean.
Yeah.
Yeah.
That's what I was going to ask you about Göbekli Tepe, as it really was a shocker as people started discovering when this structure was made. The question I have is, do we have anything that goes way further back that is stone monuments of some sort, or at least resembling this kind of building structure from hunter-gatherers? And then if we don't, would it be a shock to discover that maybe there are some structures similar to like what we see with Göbekli Tepe going back 3,000-4,000 years before that into the Ice Age area or time frame?
Yeah. So, well, first off, with Göbekli Tepe, it's actually less of a shock than, I don't know, that's everybody on YouTube makes it out to be.
Yeah, we do.
You know, I actually wonder if this comes from Graham Hancock treating
Right.
it so magnanimously. I mean, a little bit from the excavators, they trumpeted it, and it was an amazing find. I'm not trying to say that it's not a super cool site, but what it has is monumental architecture, and we'd already discovered monumental architecture from the same time period nearby. So, you know, you have Tel Es Sultan Jericho, also known as Jericho. Kathleen Kenyon excavated that in the 1960s from the exact same time period as Göbekli Tepe. There we actually have agriculturalists, sedentary people, unlike Göbekli Tepe where there's hunter-gatherers. And there's monumental architecture. It's a different kind of style, but they have an enormous tower there and parts of a wall and stuff like that are, you know, extremely monumental. And just as large and impressive as Göbekli Tepe. And similarly, this kind of T-shaped megalithic structures, Göbekli Tepe was not the first one found. Klaus Schmidt, who excavated Göbekli Tepe, previously excavated Neveli Chori, and which is also, I think, hunter-gatherers with the same type of monumental architecture. It dates a little later than Göbekli Tepe, but it's just a little bit later, like a few hundred years, and it's the same style and everything. It's just not, it wasn't as impressively complete, if you see what I mean. So we had it there, we could reconstruct it in our mind's eye, but it was not as complete and impressive looking as Göbekli Tepe, and that's part of what makes it so impressive. Is it stands out in the eyes, if you see what I mean, and that's good for showing what it is. We definitely, and so in that situation, even in the same area, we have clear evidence of for thousands of years before Göbekli Tepe of the Natufian culture. Starting to live semi-sedentary lives, hunter-gatherers. They're not agriculturalists, but they're starting to sort of play with cultivating plants. So they're sort of helping them out, but they're not actually harvesting them and then planting them, if you see what I mean. Mm-hmm. But they're you know, trying to help them out in different ways, sometimes with fire, sometimes in other sorts of ways. And so we know that they're harvesting these wild plants intensively. They're storing them even so that they can be consumed over months and maybe even future years. They're grinding them and processing them intensively, just like at Göbekli Tepe. And they're also starting to build more larger and larger structures. They're not as impressive as Göbekli Tepe, but they show the development in that region of different sort of architectural skills and know-how, if you see what I mean. But most of their structures were sort of more for storage, things like that, less these kind of ceremonial type structures that sort of stand out, like the tower at Jericho or like the enclosures at Göbekli Tepe. Yeah.
Is it safe to say that the time on their hands to build structures like that is due to them knowing how to store more food to be able to eat more because they're not preoccupied with every single day 9 to 9, not no 9 to 5, 9 to 9 or 5 to whenever it's dark, hunting to get food? They find better ways to reserve it, store it, and now they have a little more time in their hands to do other activities.
Yeah, I think so. I mean, in that area in particular, these different groups of people had found very successful niches. So, at Göbekli Tepe, they found this niche where, in the spring, they come up there when the weather starts getting nice from the lowlands to the uplands. And at that time, the grain is ready to harvest. It would have been harvestable earlier in the lowlands, if you see what I mean, because it's warmer. And so they come to the uplands, and it's a staggered harvest, therefore, of this kind of wild wheat that's growing. And then you wait a few months, they store that wild wheat, they grind it, they might ferment it into beer, they might turn it into porridge. That kind of stuff is the evidence we have. And then a few months later, the gazelle come through the pass. And so we can tell exactly what month they're coming through from the isotopic signatures and the kill-off patterns that zooarchaeologists have studied. And so we actually can therefore tell when they're up there. They're up there for the warm parts of the season. So they're moving sort of seasonally between the lowlands in the colder seasons and then the uplands in the warmer seasons to exploit these different niches. And then while they're there, they have plentiful time. They harvest that wheat, it stores. They're waiting for those gazelle to come through. And so right nearby is the quarries for it, that they get the stone to build Göbekli Tepe, and they have time on their hands. And, they do this. They follow this seasonal way of life for, it's over 1,000 years at that site. So you think about it from today to the end of the Roman Empire, right? That's the amount of time, I think even longer, that they're at this site. And so, so much time to be able to develop this kind of ceremonial center. And then, of course, the team is now starting to excavate further away from the ceremonial center. And Graham says, oh, my God, the older buildings are nicer than the next buildings. And it's like, that's because this is the ceremonial center. And then the other buildings are just where they're living and where they're grinding their grain and storing their grain. And, of course, you go to any city and you have a ceremonial center that's built, like in Washington, D.C. in the 19th century. And then you have other areas built in the 20th century that aren't as grand as what we built in the 19th century. And that doesn't mean our technology is more inferior. It's because that's when that ceremonial center was constructed and they maintained it, if you see what I mean. There was no reason to update it. And so, I mean, that happens all the time in different cities and settlements throughout the world.
That's exactly what I was going to mention, because I know there are friends of mine who are into this alternative stuff who think that look at the stones under civilizations that come later, massive stones. For example, the Herodian aspect of the Jewish temple and remnants that are left of it, those stones are massive. The Herodian stones are massive. Then you can go to the later civilizations who built on it, stacking smaller blocks, and you go, well, it's an inferior build compared to Herodians.
And it's actually the opposite, probably. You look at sort of cultures and technology over time. We've always gone from sort of larger things to smaller, more modular things. And you can see that today we're building with concrete, right? Where it's become dust that we can manipulate however you want. Building with smaller stones and mortar and things like that is actually going to be more sturdy. It's going to be more easy to repair over time. And so, this idea of larger stones is more superior technology. It's actually the exact opposite. Everywhere you look, it goes from kind of larger stones to smaller stones, because smaller stones are more efficient and more repairable, and they're more sturdy, And so this misnomer that, I don't know, these people sell as if large stones somehow means superior technology, and I just don't get it. If everywhere you look, it's the exact opposite.
I know in Egypt, according to Dr. Cooney, in Egypt, the initial dynasties are building these magnificent pyramids, and then the argument they'll usually make is, look at these raunchy little half-ass pyramids that come later. They must have lost this secret technology again, right? This kind of argumentation. And she's like, it's her opinion, and I suspect other Egyptologists who say, actually, what's going on is they already have their dynasty established. Here's this massive ass, constructions. We don't need to like compete with that. We'll make our own little, like, here's my little pyramid that represents me and my kingdom. But like, these are already magnificently done. We don't need to keep making this kind of structure. It's already happened. And how much money, time, and energy that went into that, it almost became a way to, this symbolizes my dynasty and my ruling as well, even though they were initially used for initial pharaohs. Another way of putting it is, this is a little more complex, but in biblical literature, you had this back when the kings ruled and the gods ordained the kings to be in power. It wasn't just Bible. We're talking Mesopotamia, Syria, Babylon. The gods gave the kings the rights, and it was always like, this is God given to the kings. Later, when there were no more kings in the Judean regions, the scribes take that authority that was once a kingly thing and attribute it to themselves. Well, in ancient Egypt, you could say later kings, later pharaohs are just taking the earlier clout that comes from these massive structures and applying it to themselves and saying, do I really need to go and build that again? I mean, it's already there. You know what I mean?
And look, styles and attitudes change. You could look at the development of phones over time, and they're initially these massive fucking things, and then eventually they become smaller and smaller. Then we get the touch screen, and now they become bigger again because there's, it's style and fads. You can see this with cars. There's the big cars, but then you get a sports car and it's a tiny little thing. Size and stuff like that. The styles change. What people do to impress other people changes over time. There's no reason to think that, the only way to express power is through having the largest monument. There's so many different ways to express your status and your power and your wealth. And sometimes it's through very small things in subtle ways. Others times it's through something more in your face. And it's just sort of, I don't understand why we think there's only one way to do something that's more impressive than another. It's a very reductive way of thinking about our ancestors. Yeah.
The final point I'd like to make is I've engaged with many people online from various stripes. And oftentimes there's this accusation of people like me, I call myself an atheist, who say, they want to put the burden of proof on me. And many atheists online go, well, we're not the ones who have to bear the burden. You need to prove the existence of this omniscient, omnibenevolent, the arguments. I'm sure you've seen them online. Everyone has come across this stuff. But in your case, it's a special kind of position, in my opinion. I could make a strong, positive case against the existence of Yahweh, which I have done in a recent documentary I just launched. In this case of archaeology, they want to you could easily just shift the burden and say, you need to prove it exists. You haven't done that. And he wants to do this God of the gaps kind of thing where it's like, it's out there. You just haven't found it yet. Wishful thinking, hopeful, all of that. Is there evidence in your mind that isn't just shifting it back to them for them to carry the burden, but you think is definitive evidence that proves the case that we don't have these advanced civilizations? I thought you mentioned something about ships being in the water, things that would prove.
Yeah, there's a range of things. I mean, look, so I didn't really treat this as a debate. I taught it more as a classroom. Largest classroom I could ever have, right? I'm there. I get a chance to actually teach what I do. And so that was my real goal. It wasn't even, and the idea of having to disprove his ideas, which, are never published in a sort of scientific way. So there's no reason to critique them in that kind of way. As I mentioned, I mean, look, he's very honest about being biased. He even has this blog on his website saying he thinks of himself as an attorney, a lawyer, with his client being this lost civilization. And he wants to present this theory in the best light possible. So of course he's going to be selective about his evidence, if you see what I mean. And so as I showed with those EdFood texts, he's extremely selective, putting together those sentences from different pages. And so I really saw this as, look, there's no way to really debate somebody who's just categorically opposed to, looking at archaeology in the way that scholars look at archaeology. And so I really used it as kind of an example to really teach archaeology to a large audience. And of course, I framed it around the topic of the conversation, which was, is there this lost civilization? And yeah, I definitely think there's strong archaeological evidence against it. I mean, this is why I'm writing this book, and I'm going to be YouTubing more about this topic, is because, this idea was considered seriously in scholarship in the 19th century and sort of discarded. But at this point, we have so much more evidence, especially the last, 50, 70, 100 years in many countries where cultural heritage laws have been put into place. And the public just does not quite understand the scale of archaeological evidence that we have. I mean, Graham Hancock claims there's this global civilization, and he says it's, underwater because of sea level rise at the end of the Ice Age. And he critiques underwater archaeology because they've uncovered, thousands and tens of thousands and hundreds of thousands of shipwrecks. And he says, but you're not finding many settlements. So you're doing the wrong thing. If you want to test my hypothesis, you should be looking for settlements underwater, for Ice Age stuff underwater. And it's sort of like, wait a second, hold on, Graham. You're trying to say this is a global civilization where there's trade across the oceans and across the seas. Where are your shipwrecks? If we're focused on finding shipwrecks, well, there should be shipwrecks from your civilization. This is just a no-brainer. If we know how to find shipwrecks and we're so successful at finding them from all the different periods where humans have ships, well, what the heck, where are yours, And so that was one of my big ones. The other one was just to focus on all the coastal evidence we have, and even the underwater evidence we have from the Ice Age, the stuff in the Sahara, the tens and thousands, hundreds of thousands of sites and millions of artifacts around the world, and just say, look, we are able to predict, by looking at the geology of the landscape, for areas to survey for Stone Age finds, because we know there's exposed Stone Age soils due to erosion, due to uplift, due to different kinds of things. And we go there and we look and we find Stone Age stuff all the time, whether it's coastlands, whether it's in forests, whether it's in deserts. And we find this stuff and we're targeting this stuff. We're looking for it, but your stuff ain't there. And then third of all, as I brought up for in the middle, I think, of the conversation, is domestication. And, it's sort of like you look at the evidence, and this is not even new stuff. This is taught at like an intro level of how were plants domesticated. We've known about this for 40, 50 years since we first learned that we can recover these seeds, seeds that are carbonized in a sense by doing what's called flotation. We can sample some of the soil, and all of our excavations come up with hundreds, if not thousands, if not tens of thousands sometimes, or even hundreds of thousands in some sites, of these seeds, right? And so we know how that shift from the scar happens and how it falls off the plant. And we've known about this since the 1980s with Gordon Hillman, and we've started to understand through testing it ourselves how this mechanism occurs, because it's accidental. It's when we start planting those plants, there's this evolutionary adaptation, this sort of pressure for the seed to stay on the plant, so it's collected and then replanted, if you see what I mean. And
one comment on that, Joe tried to kind of get you to go deeper, and I appreciated it, but I also thought in my head, if I was this kind of alternative conspiracy theorist, I would want to know, okay, hold on, is there a way to reverse that? So if they stop doing this agricultural thing due to, let's just say, I don't know, a catastrophe for thousands of years, did the plants come back to normal, not having the scar? You almost have an evolutionary process, which I loved his enthusiasm on being shocked at how plants almost have a mind of their own in terms of the evolution process. But it sounded like he was trying to leave open room for, hey, this catastrophe happens, restart, humans have to reboot, takes a couple thousand years. No wonder the plants are back to normal again. And then they have to re-agricultural, kind of giving.
Well, so what I was trying to get across during the conversation, and I don't think I did a good job answering this because I wasn't quite expecting it, because chronologically, time-wise, it makes no sense. Like, the timing of this disaster, Graham Hancock changes his mind on when this disaster occurs multiple times. Sometimes, for a while, he thought it occurred with Meltwater Pulse 1b, which is at the end of the Younger Dryas. Now he subscribes to the Younger Dryas impact hypothesis, which is at the start of the Younger Dryas, though we don't have evidence for much sea level rise at that time. And
can you give us dates, just so people...
something, I'd have to look it up exactly, but something like about 11,000 600 or 500 BCE
Okay.
would be the start of the Younger Dryas. And something like 1,500, 2,000 years later is the end of the Younger Dryas and has that meltwater pulse 1b. And the mechanics here, I didn't want to go into them because I'm not a geologist and I don't want to have to talk too much. I mean on the show, the Joe Rogan thing. I'm happy to chat about it more casually here because I won't be challenged. But I don't want to be challenged on geology. I'm not an expert on it, right? And so, the Younger Dryas we've known about for a while. It's a period where it actually gets colder. And it goes back to kind of ice age-like conditions. And so that's why there's more ice on the poles, and actually the sea level doesn't go up. And so it's only at the end of the Younger Dryas when it gets warmer again and the poles melt that we get that meltwater pulse 1b. And so if you look at the timing for agriculture, there is no time for this kind of reversion back to feral is the problem, because we get our early signs of agriculture during, the Younger Dryas kind of period. And so, if this disaster happened, there's not thousands of years for this sort of feralization to occur to the start of domestication that we see, right?
So
and
another way of putting it is before this 2000, let's just say a 2,000-year block of catastrophe that they're claiming is like this really shift in
which
the
it
Younger
probably
Dryas.
isn't, by the way. It's just
right.
Cool. Yeah.
Yeah, you were saying that too. That's a whole nother show, right?
Yeah.
Have an expert who, maybe you can recommend one for me to dive into this.
Yeah.
But like before that, if there was this massive civilization of some sort, however high you want to put it, technological, or even if it's not all that, whatever, to try and keep your position alive, in the agricultural world, you're saying the seeds we've discovered, these are natural. Like they have not already domesticated this. There's no evidence.
Yeah. And then the other thing that I was thinking, which I should have brought up to make it simpler. Sorry, I should have brought it up earlier here to make it simpler, is we should be able to have the relic of that earlier domestication event in the DNA. So when you think about it, when you domesticate a species, only a small population has been selected by humans for planting. And so there's this genetic bottleneck that occurs, if you see what I mean, where the adaptation of that hanging on to the plant, that provides a strong pressure, a selective pressure, which causes the descendants of that seed that has that mutation to be selected for. And so that happens repeatedly with repeated plantings. And what ends up happening is when you end up with a new population of domesticated wheat or whatever it is, rice or corn or peas or beans or whatever, you end up with a very small genetic subsection of the larger population that existed that was wild. And so you see this bottleneck in all kinds of, in the DNA itself, in a wide range of gene expressions. And so, it's sort of like, if you think about it, when humans left Africa, humans leave Africa. It's just a small group of humans that leave Africa. There's much more genetic diversity in the group of humans that's left behind in Africa than the small group that goes out of Africa. And still to this day, there's much more genetic diversity in African populations than in non-African populations because of that, what's called a founder effect. The founding population moves out. It's just a small percentage of all the genes that existed in the larger population that stay behind. And so, it's the same thing with domestication. The plants, in a sense, have the selection pressure. Only a small percentage of them meet that selection pressure, and therefore what ends up domesticated goes through this genetic bottleneck. And so we can track that very easily in the genes of domesticated plants, but that would also have a relic in the wild population. We'd be able to see this, if you see what I mean, in the diversity of different plants that we have that are wild and collected in this period. And to
nail this down, just so everyone is following, to make this very simple, in the wild life of plants, before the Younger Dryas claims to have happened, which we're saying claims because that's what Graham is trying to run with, there is no evidence of any domesticated wild plants being domesticated anywhere before this time by human civilizations, period. In the genetic code,
there's certainly evidence of gathering. There's certainly evidence of helping those plants thrive in their natural environment, in a sense, but there's no evidence of agriculture in the sense of planting. And so nowhere...
He tried to go, okay, hold on, maybe they didn't do that. They're shamanistic. You notice how he tried to,
maybe they didn't actually teach them. Maybe they didn't actually bring agriculture. They just showed them that it was possible. And it's like, well,
right.
okay, then how did they know it was possible? And I also want to be clear. Unlike stone, we can and we do radiocarbon date seeds. They are organic material. We can radiocarbon date them directly. And every single time we run a DNA test, we also radiocarbon date the stuff. That's standard operating procedures for labs. And we radiocarbon date these seeds all the time. And so we have direct dates of these wild and domesticated seeds. Yeah.
Dr. Flint Dibble, I really hope that another round can happen. And I say with you and Joe, that would be a fascinating conversation. Let Joe bring his critical questions. Let him challenge. Let him but like without getting distracted by some of Graham's stuff, let Joe bring his own stuff. I'd love to see another episode because I want more good scholarship to be popular. In fact, MythVision, due to its origins being kind of in the alternative pseudo explanations of things, becoming someone who's growing up realizing, whoa, the people who are actually closer to what is taking place are the academics in the field. And I think that that's a good rule of thumb. Because what is the consensus on this? Well, why? Why do they think that? And then if you disagree with that, have good reasons to think, what you think. Don't go starting pseudo, starting alternative, and then work backwards. Even though I'm not going to knock it because that's the path that I kind of took. I feel like an analogy is Jake Paul. For those who've never been into boxing, they go through the route of someone like Jake Paul to get into boxing. Hopefully, we can look at a light at the end of the tunnel and say, maybe Graham Hancock is actually creating fans of serious scholarship. I know that I'm trying to be optimistic.
No, I mean, I know some archaeologists that started off liking and reading Graham and then went to university and took some courses, and then they realized, oh, this is actually all the evidence we have, and the way archaeologists look at it, it works by and large, and they're constantly testing it and working to improve it. And, that's what we do. We have a huge amount of evidence. That's the kind of thing that I think people don't quite understand, is just the scale and amount of evidence we have and how much we've had to test the ways we, apply chronology to pottery typology. And, we're constantly testing that, and we're constantly refining it and improving it, but it works by and large. Same thing with stone tools, same thing with seeds, same thing with bones, same thing with different kind of soils things, same thing with different methods now, like DNA and isotopes. We actually have built huge databases that the public doesn't quite understand because obviously these technologies are so new that we're still in the process of publishing those huge data sets, these sort of projects that if you're not at a conference, you wouldn't even know about, if you see what I mean. And so they're slowly coming out, data sets of, I think I just saw one published of isotopes in the Caribbean, and it's something like 20,000 different isotope samples have now been published just in the Caribbean. And so it's like, that's just isotope analysis. Imagine all the bones in the teeth that those isotopes came from, different species, different plants, different animals, and humans. And so, it's just sort of like we have this really big, robust set of evidence, and we're constantly improving on it, and as we should be. That's what we do. Our job is to keep interrogating our evidence for the past and improving the ways we go about it, the methods and questions we ask, and then what we can say about it. We're constantly rewriting history, as I like to say. That's what we do. Yeah.
Well, thank you so much, Dr. Flint Dibble. Ladies and gentlemen, go subscribe to his YouTube channel. Follow him on Twitter X. Are there any other platforms that people can follow you or check you out at that you recommend?
Yeah, I've just started doing Instagram since people followed me on there. So I guess Instagram as well. Yeah.
Awesome. I really appreciate your knowledge. I'm sure we have more to get into in ancient Greece and connections. You're going to be interviewing with my dear friend Neil from Gnostic Informant. He is huge.
He got in touch with me. Yeah.
He loves the Greek stuff. I love it too, but he's jumping on that with you, and I'm sure we can do some stuff as well down the road. I'm curious, by the way, on when you talk about oral traditions, maybe a future episode talking about the earlier Hittite version of the Trojan War, and maybe possibly even getting into how Greeks competed orally in their myths with the ancient Near East. Because I know that Bruce Loudon, I don't know if you've ever heard of him, he wrote a book called Homer's Odyssey in the Near East. And in it, he actually goes to try and show that no other ancient Near Eastern story compares or parallels to Homer's Odyssey more than the Bible.
Yeah.
And I love that because I see some interesting overlap in the way that the themes and genres and the motifs and stuff are working. I don't know about making any genetic arguments because that's harder to try and do, but like something's going on where there's some communication going on between these people. And a lot of scholars in Bible arena want to go, well, the linguistics are so foreign because that's like Proto-Indo-European type language, and this is more Semitic, and therefore they can't be discussing on that level until Hellenism. And I'm going, if that's the
we
case,
definitely see. Look, there's a ton of contacts between the Greek world and the Near East. I mean, look, this kind of storytelling stuff is not what I do as much. That might be a little tough for me to talk about that with the Hittite traditions, but I can certainly talk about the kind of contacts that existed. And certainly before Hellenism, you know, we even call it the Orientalizing period, which is basically the 7th century BC, where you see this huge influx of ideas, motifs, from the east to the west, and then different things going from Greece back to the Near East. There's a lot of contact in those periods, sort of right when the Old Testament is forming, at the same time when the Iliad and the Odyssey is forming, and then certainly with the New Testament, that's under the, you know, the top, after years of Hellenization and Romanization. So you see that kind of stuff. But yeah, the Mediterranean is a very diverse place. 3 different continents meet there, and people are moving around so much because it's so easy to move by water. You know, they were quite expert at traversing the sea from the Bronze Age onwards, and even before the Bronze Age, but especially from the Bronze Age onwards. Yeah.
Thank you. Like this video, share this out with somebody, and hopefully Joe Rogan takes a peek and has you back. Thank you, Dr. Flint Dibble.
Thank you so much, Derek. I appreciate it.